them, how you deploy an ETL solution, et cetera. And when you are making that a product-facing thing, it's even harder, because now you have to think about user experience on top of all the complications related to data. So one of my good friends, Graham Gansel, will be giving that talk next month. It's going to be a very practical talk, because Graham is an amazing person, but he's also an amazing presenter. So please come next month, because that's going to be, if you haven't experienced the pains and challenges of deploying a data product, Graham will give you some insight, but also some lessons learned, some things to build on. Beyond that, we have a handful of people who've reached out to me about talks in the near future. If you haven't reached out to me about a talk, please do. Haven't nailed down May, June, or July, and I kind of want to get that done in the next couple weeks. And somewhere in there, we're going to do what I promised before, which is our lightning talks. Just as a reminder, there's been a number of people who've told me, well, I don't really have enough content for, say, a 30, 45-minute talk, but I do have something cool to show, like in a 5, 10-minute thing. So please reach out to me. Like, we can talk about the nitty-gritty of a TensorFlow actual tensor, or we can talk about like something broader, some project you have built. So please reach out to me. Our talks here are very high quality, so we've had the good fortune of being selective. But that said, we do things that you are building, you're working on, that can be either as a hobbyist or in production. We would love to see it. One final thing is that we have a Pi and AI event coming up at the end of this month. It will be at Facebook. They are hosting, I think it's March 28th, but I'll send out that date. They are going to house, I think, 250 attendees, and there's already a number of people on the Facebook side who have signed up for it. And so we haven't fully broadcasted that just yet, but please come out. That's going to be at the end of March. I think it's March 28th, but I'll confirm that. I'm really excited about that one because we're partnering with deeplearning.ai, and if you're not familiar with them, they are fairly well known in the Twitter data science AI community. So one more thing, so I'd like to thank our sponsors, both Capital Factory and Kung Fu AI. We've had the good fortune of partnering with both for quite some time. Capital Factory, they hosted every event. It's very difficult to have an open forum like we have here with a lot of space, a lot of chairs, AV support, all of that. So special thanks to them. I'd also like to thank kungfu.ai. Had a good fortune of getting to know those guys, and we have one of their representatives, Max. He's going to say a couple things about Kung Fu.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for coming. I'm a big fan of the Austin Deep Learning Meetup. I've come to the meetups for a while now. They're great. I'm also really excited for this talk. I saw the first part of this a month ago. How long ago was it? 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was great, and so I'm very excited for this next one. So a few words on Kung Fu AI. We are an artificial intelligence services company. So basically businesses who have some concept of AI or machine learning, or maybe just a pile of data, they come to us and they say, hey, you guys do machine learning. We want to make use of that. And we build products for them. So we try to help with several different parts of their business. But if you are somebody who does machine learning and you think you could contribute to machine learning services, or if you have a company and you think you could benefit from machine learning services, please feel free to come talk to me afterwards. I look like this. Some of the brands that we've worked with before are up here, and we'd love to add yours as well. So I'll be around. Thanks.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Kung Fu AI. A couple of things I want to plug before we get going. We have a Slack channel. A lot of people have signed up for it. A lot of people who, I think there's a couple channels in our Slack group that are highly used. I think a couple of them we may have to reorganize to make it clear that there is actual communication going on, specifically the general channel. But there's a lot of conversation going on in our Slack channel. Please join if you haven't already. It can be the conversations can be about everything from, hey, what's the latest and greatest from Jan LeCun, or what is the latest fight on Twitter, down to, hey, this is the challenge I'm having with my Keras code, my TensorFlow code, my PyTorch code. So please, please join the Slack channel. If you don't know how to do that, go to the meetup site. You have to be logged in. Scroll to the bottom of the Austin Deep Learning meetup site, and there will be a link to a Heroku app. and that should take care of everything for you. One final thing I want to plug is we have a more advanced group. It's the Journal Club. The Journal Club, we're talking about from papers that are fairly rigorous, but there is usually about the cutting edge things going on in either machine learning, deep learning, or some combination thereof. Not everything is about neural nets. Sorry to all you neural net people. Jim, joke. Anyway, it's a great conversation that we have. Feel free to come out. We usually have somewhere between 20, 30 people come out. Great conversation. So please see me if you'd like to know any more details. All right, without further ado, we're going to get started with the actual talk. I would like to welcome Sanjeev. He gave a tremendous talk on the history of AI a couple weeks ago. As Max said before, it was fascinating. And Sanjeev did a great job of actually talking about going way back, not just like, okay, what was IBM doing in the 70s or 80s, but he went way back and he tied a lot of things about the philosophy and the history of intelligence and learning and the like up through 1980. And I am super excited about this talk tonight. So Sanjeev, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Hey everyone, my name is Sanjeev. I'm a data scientist at Yonder, just across the street over there. And today, you guys are all here for the History of AI Part 2. One of the motivations behind giving this talk was to just think about the way that the trends that we're looking at now in some way do mirror all the hype that was going on in the 1960s before the first AI winter. And one thing I want to really emphasize is that there's more than one way to think about problems, and putting all your eggs in one basket and one method or one way of looking at a problem can really limit you. And I think looking at the historical perspective and then thinking about how other fields have thought about the same problems is the ideal way to really refine what you're thinking about and look at things from a different perspective. So that's kind of what I try to do here today. I'm trying to mix together a huge amount of different information from different fields to unify into one story to help you think about the problems that we're looking at today. So last time I was here 3 weeks ago, I discussed the history of mainly symbolic AI and some of the prehistory for the mathematical and philosophical questions that were circulating prior to the famous Dartmouth conference in 1956, where the term was first coined. So we ended with the first and second AI winters in the 1980s, and we're going to pick up right there where we left off, looking at the fields that grew into their own from the 1980s onward that used approaches that were different from symbolic AI. And we're going to end with some work in computational neuroscience, which I think will help tie all these ideas together. So like last time, I'm going to be organizing this around two motivating questions. And the first question is, what is intelligence? When we talked about this last time, we were thinking about how common sense reasoning can be created inside of artificial systems. And we talked a little bit about the Turing test as an example of a way to assess intelligence in that you are trying to use a computer to convince another person that they're talking to a machine and not talking to a human and not a machine. So one thing that we ended on last time was thinking about if intelligence is purely based on computation, or if there's some other types of ways of looking at intelligence that are different from that. And we're going to explore those today. The other topic was how intelligent systems represent knowledge. So representation is one of those words that's used in a lot of different fields, and in computer science, it often has something to do with data structures in some way. But the representations that we have as humans are in some way different from this. And this is related to something I mentioned in the last talk called the symbol grounding problem, which very briefly is the idea of how the syntactic rules in a symbolic logic system get connected to actual meaning or semantics, which is something that humans are able to do, but it's an open question of whether or not artificial intelligence can actually do this. So we're going to explore this today as well. So now we're going to jump right in, and we're going to start with two areas which are probably very familiar to you all, connectionism in neural networks and machine learning. These are the most common ways to look at AI that we think about today. And they really got their start in the 1980s, primarily thanks to an increase in computing power at the time. We had the ability to parse much larger data sets with higher dimensionality. And this led to the creation of a field that was at the time called inductive learning. And today we think of machine learning as a subfield of computer science, but it has deep ties with statistics. And you have these algorithms that were developed that run over many iterations that enable us to optimally map inputs to outputs. So this is going to be intimately tied to another developing field at the time in the 1980s called Connectionism. And we're going to explore machine learning and Connectionism together in the next couple slides. So Connectionism goes back as far as the 1940s. I would really define it as for the first type of exploration in this area from the threshold logic unit. The inspiration for this was from the Spanish neuroanatomist Cayal, who was the first to really map out the brain. And this led to a lot of work in neurology in the 1900s. And by the 1940s, McCullough and Pitts had seen a lot of this work, and they were inspired to try to create something, a mathematical function that would distill down the basic properties of these neurons of the brain cells, and try to make a mathematical function that would mimic very roughly the properties that it had. And this is a very simple model. It's nothing like actual neurons, but it was a starting point that would later lead to Rosenblatt's Perceptron model in 1957. So in 1957, this work was actually influenced by Hebb's work in self-organizing neural systems from 1949. And Rosenblatt would publish a number of works throughout the 50s and 60s looking at artificial neurons, a version that he created called the perceptron, that were linked together in networks, kind of like how the human cortex, the same kind of patterns the human cortex uses. This, again, is an approximation. It's not really like what the human brain does, but it captures the general properties of this. And while this was an area of huge interest, the optimism around it was killed in the 1960s when Minsky and Papert would publish a book on this topic that showed that it was unable to solve the XOR problem, which briefly has to do with XOR logic gates, being able to predict the outputs in this binary classification task. And so it was believed at the time that the perceptron could not handle nonlinear decision boundaries. And so it fell out of favor in research and in academic circles throughout the 1970s. And it wouldn't be revitalized properly until the 1980s, when Hinton, Rumelhart, and McClelland would develop the general theory around connectionism, which is very similar to the ideas that we think about today. So in 1986, they would publish a series of 2-volume work, which is kind of a classic text in connectionism, where they would use a multi-layered perceptron and the backpropagation algorithm. Now, although they are often credited for the backpropagation algorithm, it had actually been developed previously in control theory in the 1960s by Keeley and Bryson, and later in artificial neural networks by Paul Werbos in 1974. But it was Hinton and Rumelhart and McClelland that created the modern version of it as we think about it today. And connectionism gives us some kind of insight into the question of representation, how the symbols that are used in these computer programs stand in for things in the real world that are in reference to them. And one way we can look at this question is by looking at the idea of local representation. So in the last talk, where we focused on symbolic AI, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the entities in the model, the symbols, and what they represent out in the world. And we capture this in what Newell and Simon called a physical symbol system. This is something we talked about last time. But in the 1980s, for connectionism, the field was referred to as parallel distributed processing, where your representations are spread out in a neural network. They're not tied down to one symbol or to one neuron, but you have something like a pattern of activation or a landscape of activation where the representation is split up into what is often called a subsymbol. So sometimes this is referred to as subsymbolic AI. We're not dealing on the level of symbols anymore, but more of a distributed processing that's taking place in these neural networks. So this caused a lot of controversy in the philosophy literature as well as the AI literature about what representations are and whether these systems are really any more intelligent than the symbolic systems that came before them. I've cited one paper here at the top, citation 2 here, which is one of the classic papers criticizing connectionism at the time. So throughout the 1980s, there would be a number of important victories in the area of connectionism. And one of the classic papers comes from LeCun and his coworkers using neural networks for handwritten zip code detection. And as they note in this paper, the network is fed images rather than feature vectors, which was a unique landmark for its time. So there are other highlights from this time period, classic machine learning techniques that we still use today. One of them would be, for example, the usage of decision trees for classification. So decision trees actually go back probably as far as Fisher's work in the 1930s for discriminant analysis, but it was Bryman's classic textbook in 1984 that really brought together a lot of different ideas and the way we think about classification and decision trees today. There would also be the rise of explorations into ensemble methods and boosting algorithms, for example, Shapir's work in 1990, which is another kind of classic area of machine learning that's still in use today. So throughout the 90s, there were multiple innovations. Two really important ones would be 1995, random forests and support vector machines. These are still popular today. They've been overshadowed a bit by deep learning at this point, but they're still useful for many different types of problems. And we saw a number of different neural network architectures developed during the 1990s too, and including, for example, the first convolutional neural network. This is a term I hadn't even heard about until probably 5 years ago, but really the papers originated in the early 90s. And many other machine learning techniques had been developed during this time too. And in 2001, this is about the time when the well-known textbook by Hastie and Tibshirani was published, which really classifies, categorizes all these major techniques, and is still kind of a classic textbook that's used today. But by the 2000s, neural networks were popular, but they weren't necessarily any better for a particular task than any other type of. There are certain tasks they were very good at, but they weren't good at all types of tasks for machine learning. And all this would change in 2006 when Hinton and his coworkers would publish the Deep Belief Network paper. And this is kind of the beginning of the moment when AI would suddenly re-enter the public zeitgeist, and we'd start seeing it everywhere all of a sudden. Before this point, it was part of science fiction and cyberpunk, and suddenly we're seeing AI everywhere, and all these technologies, we're talking about it online. This is really where it came about with the field of deep learning. And this was bolstered by a number of graphics processing unit innovations, GPUs. The ideas from the 1980s were taken with much larger data sets and using many more neurons, and so you need a lot of parallel computation. And GPUs, which are used for a lot of graphics processing in gaming and in movies, creating movies, and a lot of graphics-intensive computing, could carry out these operations in a reasonable amount of time. So NVIDIA, the graphics card manufacturer, led the way in innovating in this area. And by 2012, the AlexNet paper was published, where for the first time it was shown that deep learning could achieve better than human performance for image detection. And that's kind of where it all took off from here. In 2012, you had the Harvard Business Review article calling data scientists the sexiest job of the 21st century. And this is where we see all the proliferation of AI applications in industry, commercial products, and research. And it's the reason where we have things like self-driving cars, which use segmentation. And we can have AI for medical diagnosis, and we have it in our phones for voice recognition, and other important things like Snapchat filters. And one of the other important landmarks happened in 2017 when the context for this is that the Chinese board game Go was considered a classic problem in AI that was very difficult because of the enormous state space the game has. There's so many different combinations of configurations in the game that finding the optimal strategy with the right heuristics in a reasonable amount of time was really difficult. But AlphaGo, developed by DeepMind in London, was able to beat a Go grandmaster, and this was a real landmark for AI, showing its real potential for the first time. In 2018, Bengio, LeCun, and Hinton would share the Turing Award for their work in deep learning, and they're often kind of considered the kind of grandfathers of this modern deep learning movement. So at this point now, deep learning almost overshadows many other techniques that are out there, and it's used everywhere, and it's kind of the dominant area where it's being used in academic research. But it's often very expensive, and it can be very slow for big data sets. And those of you who work in tech companies know just how hard it is to get this kind of thing into production and to scale it up on the level that you really need. So thinking about this now, we're going to return to the same questions that I posed at the very beginning about intelligence and representation, and look at where connectionism and machine learning fall along these lines. So one thing about these fields is that they're very domain specific. They can do one task really well if they're trained on that task with the right data, but they don't generalize across all different types of fields like the human mind does. They also rely a lot on really good, nice, clean data. And in the real world, data is messy, it's missing, it doesn't have labels, and we have to do a lot of engineering to get these labels in here, a lot of human labor to get engineered labeled data sets which are appropriate for this task. There are a lot of new unsupervised learning methods going on right now, a lot of developments here that are still in their infancy that might help to unlock some of this potential of not relying so much on human-created data, but that's still in its infancy. And there's a lot of discussion that this is an advanced form of curve fitting rather than intelligence. You have some data points, and you're just trying to fit some sort of mathematical function to those points. You're not really doing anything intelligent. This is one commonly leveled complaint against deep learning. However, we have much more flexible representations than symbolic architectures had. And you can capture a large type of problems, but symbols themselves are still not grounded autonomously. We ourselves have grounded symbols that we use in our brains, and we teach the machine what those are. But they are not actually grounding symbols themselves and learning about how the things they're representing and inside of the programs actually represent something or stand in for something in the real world. So if you think about what a neural network is, you might imagine that it's a tiny piece, a simulated artificial piece of the human cortex, a little tiny part of it. So maybe the approach might be then, if we want something that's more intelligent, more human-like intelligence, why don't we try expanding this in a way that we simulate the whole human brain, or at least what we know about it? This is an area called cognitive architectures that it's disappointing this isn't really talked about as much anymore as it used to be. But the idea here was to replicate the biology of the brain in a computer program. And it would rely on different types of approaches. The three general approaches are the symbolic approach, using symbolic logic as the architecture, connectionist approaches, which would use neural networks, or the dynamicist or emergent approaches, which kind of came about in the 90s and the 2000s, but are fairly rare. And there are a lot of hybrid architectures that use a bit from both. Under the symbolic side, the general problem solver from Newell and Simon that we talked about a few weeks ago, this one is often considered the first cognitive architecture, the first way to capture reasoning in the brain. ACT-R is probably the most well-known architecture out there. It's been continuously updated and now has connectionist memory. It won the Rumelhart Prize in 2005. It can perform decision-making, audio and visual processing. It can make vocalizations and many other types of things. Under the connectionist side, I'm not going to really go over these, but I am putting the names here if you want to look them up later. And a lot of these try to mimic neural networks in the brain by copying the different brain areas that are well known for decision-making and planning, for multisensory integration, perception, and so on. And they try to synchronize those areas together, solving the well-known neural binding problem of how different areas in the brain are bound together into one experience. So you don't experience, for example, like color and texture of an object separately. You experience everything at once. And so they use a form of synchrony to allow all these areas to communicate at the same time. And some of the emergent approaches like dynamic field theory actually use the dynamic field equations from neuroscience that were developed in the 1970s. And there are a few other architectures as well that really try to mimic what is known about the human brain. And there's hundreds more architectures than this that I've actually listed here. And the reviews that I put at the bottom right in the slide here cover many of those. And these things can do really, have a really amazing functions, and they can do a lot of things in a more integrated way, which in some sense seems to capture intelligence a bit better than just using one model for one type of problem. I really want to highlight Spawn, which is an architecture that came out in 2013, which I think is really important because the creator, Chris Eliasmith, in his 2003 paper talks about going beyond metaphors when talking about the mind. We don't have to limit ourselves to just thinking about only being a symbolicist or a connectionist or a dynamicist, which is often kind of where this war ground is in the literature, is picking a side. He combines all these ideas together in his neural engineering framework that he wrote with Charles Anderson in 2003, which uses neural representations. It implements them in a spiking neural network with nonlinear encodings and weighted linear decodings across neural populations. And the representations themselves are state variables in a dynamic system that evolved through time. So he uses a bit of everything in here, including something he calls semantic pointers, borrowing a bit from the symbolic architectures as well. This is a really cool idea that I really want to mention because his book is actually quite readable, and it was the 2013 book, and covers these ideas. And the semantic pointer is the idea is that when you have representations, you often have them in hierarchies, and you get more and more abstract as you go up. And this is kind of how the human brain works as well. You are more and more compressed as you get to the top. But a semantic pointer allows you to use the compressed representations and point down to the data structures that at the very bottom on the low levels that led up to the top. And so you have a mapping between high and low vector spaces, which is really convenient for the way this architecture works. And it was used to create a system called Spawn in a 2012 science paper, which uses 2.5 million neurons in a spiking neural network. It maps multiple areas of the brain and has a robotic arm as well that can write. And the most exciting part about this to me is that they've released the entire Python API and the Nengo frameworks. You can go and build your own spiking neural networks using different models of neurons and even download their actual architecture as well. So I encourage all of you to experiment with this. It's really, really cool. And if you need a break from deep learning for a while, this is a great place to check out other approaches to AI. Okay, so what's the verdict here for cognitive architectures? We're trying now to expand more across the human brain, but a big problem is it's difficult to scale these things. They're often over-engineered because we don't understand how the whole human brain works. So they spend a lot of time refining certain parts of the brain and these architectures, making them somewhat inflexible. And it doesn't really give us a clear idea of what representation actually is or what intelligence is. It gets a little closer, but maybe building bigger systems and using multisensory integration isn't the answer to solving this question. Maybe the answer to the question is to consider the fact that our brains evolved over an astronomically high number of training sets. Our last common ancestor goes back to 1.5 billion years, and all of that history of all organisms that lived and died in some way is compressed into our source code, our DNA, which has highly compressed submodules that you can't just study by themselves, nor can you just study neurons by themselves. To understand those things, you have to look at the context in which genes or neurons interact with the world. And a lot of these routines come out when we interact with the world themselves, not just looking at computation alone in the head. So maybe the answer to the question means we need to step out of the head and think about how agents interact with the world, and if that interaction with the world can bring us any closer to answering some of these questions. So the fields of cybernetics and control theory, which came about during the 1940s, were the first to really approach this in the modern way. And the idea was to study the interactions of humans and machines through feedback, control, and communication. And a lot of modern ideas that we talk about in neuroscience, as well as in artificial intelligence, come from this lineage. So the earliest attempt at a control system was the Watt governor in the 1800s, which was able to maintain the speed of a wheel engine despite external perturbations in the environment. So it would return back to these set points, repeatedly revisiting the same set of states and maintaining its speed. And there are many modern versions of control systems like airplanes, which use their sensors to measure what's going on outside and make internal adjustments to stay in the air or accomplish other types of goals. So it was Norbert Wiener during the 1930s. He was working on anti-aircraft research during World War II, and he made a lot of important contributions to optimal control theory and statistical estimation and control systems that we still study today and still use today. And he wanted to integrate man, animal, machine, and society into one unified system and have them communicate through feedback and signal processing and information transfer. And in the 1940s, he started the Cybernetics Club as a way to explore some of these ideas. And one of the major contributions to this field would be Claude Shannon's paper in 1948, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which is a classic paper now, and the ideas here are essentially in all communication systems that we use today. At the time, he was looking at this problem from the perspective of the telegraph, thinking about how you could make the process of transferring this information cheaper when you're sending it, when you have to take, inspired by these ideas. At this point, of course, we had radio, we have other signals, but he looked at the classic problem of the telegraph. And one of the ideas here is that the things that we study out in nature or the things that we create have structure to them. And if they have structure to them, you can predict what they're going to do. You can predict what's going to happen next. And sometimes if you can capture some of that structure, for example, when you're transmitting letters across a line, you know that certain letters follow other letters. So you don't need to transmit the entire string. There are ways to transmit only parts of things, or you can compress down a message so that it can still be transferred over a noisy channel and the message can still be received. This idea of signal and receiver is really important to cybernetics and is at the foundation of information theory and how communication systems work. And as far as representation goes, there's a fantastic book by Eric Baum written in 2004 called What is Thought, where he argues that the way that syntax and semantics become connected is when you have compressed models. When a model is compressed as it possibly can be, from the perspective of a concept called minimum description length, then you essentially have grounded symbols. That's a 30-second summary of a 400-page book, but it's a really, really cool book, and I encourage you guys to check it out. He goes over many different examples talking about that in more detail. So control theory in cybernetics would be highly influential on a number of different fields, and one of those would be reinforcement learning, which has its origins as well in psychology and neuroscience, and probably goes back as far as Pavlov's idea of trial and error learning in animals. So again, to reiterate what we're talking about here, we're talking about agent environment dynamics. We're talking about systems that we're not looking at just computation in the brain, but we're looking at how systems interact with the world and how they can learn from the world. These ideas were formalized in the 1950s through the concept of prediction errors, which is kind of like the brain's universal loss function, and would also take inspiration from the Bellman equation, which came out of economics for optimal control in dynamic systems. And the general idea in reinforcement learning is the ability of an agent to learn the value of a particular environmental state by assessing the reward when they transition to that state. They receive some sort of feedback from the environment, and they can take actions in that environment to figure out what actions and what states should be valued the most to accomplish some sort of a goal, usually to maximize long-term reward with some sort of discounting of some kind. And you would see that this field, although it started during this time, there'd be a shift throughout the 60s to a much more supervised feature learning approach through symbolic AI, and it would fall out of favor. It wasn't until the 1970s that reinforcement learning would be revived when it was understood how important action is for modern reinforcement learning theory. And it was Sutton and Bardo in the 1980s who would publish some of the classic works in this area, and their textbook is basically considered the standard for reinforcement learning today. And just as a shout out to my academic lineage, my my first postdoctoral advisor, he worked with Reed Montague for 10 years, who was the first to bring reinforcement learning into the brain as a model to study how dopaminergic neurons can actually use temporal difference learning algorithms to assess rewards in the environment. And this has been highly influential in characterizing the basal ganglia, which is used for decision making and reward learning. And it's now been so influential that some researchers like Matt Botnovic, who are in that field, have been poached out of academia, and now he works at DeepMind doing some incredible work in reinforcement learning. So we're kind of in a reinforcement learning renaissance now. Some of the computational issues and the dimensionality issues that we had before can now be solved with deep neural networks. And in the last few years, this idea of deep reinforcement learning has suddenly started showing up. And I think there's going to be some really interesting work going on here. And actually, I'm pretty sure that the AlphaGo system that I mentioned a few slides ago actually uses deep reinforcement learning as part of its computations. Okay, so what's the verdict now on cybernetics and control systems? Well, the idea is that giving agents more autonomy appears to be on the right track. But does this really give us a satisfying view of what intelligence is? One of the problems that we have here is, although we can represent this information now and these models can be learned, they're limited to specific situations still. And you have to specify the different states and the rewards that come out of those states in advance. The computer is not autonomously learning about its environment in a self-supervised way. It's still relying on human-curated information to be able to figure out what the environment is and what rewards it needs to learn to value in the environment. So this brings up the idea of, are there other ways to do this where we can just let the computers run through simulations and autonomously figure out how to solve a problem? Can we see intelligence as something that emerges out of a complex system rather than looking at just a simplified system where we have agents interacting in an environment? To really understand this, I think it's really important to look at the context that surrounded why this field started. It really got its start, I think, properly in the 1980s. But this perspective of looking at these complex systems really goes back to looking at the theory of dynamical systems, in which agent environment dynamics are extremely complex, and they have many moving parts that change together through time. And a lot of the approaches that came out during the 1990s would use dynamic systems as a way to approach AI. And the history of this really, of course, goes back to Newton and Leibniz's work, the invention of calculus, which tells us how to characterize change through time. And the early study of chaotic systems, looking at the issues that happen when you have nonlinear systems of 3 or more variables. And in general, it was at a point where we started to understand that dealing with these nonlinear systems are very difficult. It's hard to break them up into parts and study different pieces of a system individually. And you have to often resort to approximation or just running a simulation of some kind and seeing what happens. And there'd be a lot of work that would go into this area throughout up through the 70s, and some of these ideas did enter the public consciousness, like the idea of chaos theory, which I think was popularized by Gleick's famous book in the late 1980s, I think, on chaos. And these systems, just to give you an idea what these systems actually are, that we're talking about here. The next slide is a page from Strogatz's excellent textbook, Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos, that I've just reproduced here. Some of the classic problems in linear systems of 1, 2, 3, many, or a continuum of variables are things that you see in mechanics and electronics and engineering problems. These are fairly well understood for the most part, a lot of these types of phenomena. When you're talking about nonlinear systems and you get into variables along a continuum, that's where you have spatiotemporal complexity. And this area, the author of this textbook has put life on the bottom right column here. That's what life is. That's kind of the environment that we're interacting in. We're interacting with environments that change through time and space and on a continuum of different types of variables. So to some extent, understanding intelligence might have something to do with understanding how intelligence arises out of interactions with these systems, but also considering life itself to be a complex system and what kinds of properties those systems must have. So it's difficult to do this in a unified way, to talk about what complex systems are. There was a lot of work that went on in the 1980s to characterize them, and the original work started with Bertalanffy's work in open and general systems. He was against reductionism in science and wanted to think about how systems can be thought about as interactions between different parts, and how new properties can arise through emergence. And Prigogine, his work in the 1970s, when he was studying non-equilibrium thermodynamics, he was the first to note that, unlike what Newton predicted, there are some kinds of systems that are not time reversible. So if you try to run the equation backward to go where you started, because of the nonlinearities and positive and negative feedback in some of these systems, you end up running into a problem where you can't reverse the system's states. And he studied these systems, which he called far from equilibrium systems, that were also studied by Haken in physics and chemistry, self-organized systems, as well as Kaufman's work. Stewart Kaufman's a theoretical biologist from the Santa Fe Institute. In the 1980s, he studied how evolutionary networks and other systems in biology use complex dynamics like this, and how self-organization can lead to properties, as he calls, order emerging for free. So in a system that just seems to be disordered and have a lot of randomness to it, you get these wells or points of stabilities called attractors. These systems are typically open with respect to the environment. They exchange information with the environment, but still remain the same as one unit. They're far from equilibrium, meaning that on the long-term average, most systems will just spread out to the most stable state, which is the most average state. So if you're able to observe the system at any point in time, they'll be in thermal equilibrium. That's why when you molecules diffuse, they diffuse out into the most average possible configuration. But these systems are not like that. They're in a low entropy state, and they're structured, and they exist in certain configurations over time more than others. So what life is, in some sense, are systems that do this. And they have emergent properties in that local interactions can lead to global properties that are really difficult to predict in advance. And they're decentralized and distributed in their control. There's no central commander or homunculus that's determining what the structure of the system is. Order arises naturally in these systems. They're also adaptive. They resist change. This kind of borrows from control theory. The word is autopoiesis. They're able to self-maintain through time. And they're often a mixture of modularity and randomness. They have enough structure to maintain themselves as a system, but they have enough disorder in them that they can change and adapt to their external environments. So often with these types of systems, you don't know what they're going to do. You can't really predict what they're going to do in advance. You just have to run a simulation and see what happens. And this idea would be highly influential for a field that came about during the 1980s called A-life, or artificial life, and bio-inspired AI, which tried to take the genotype and phenotype of an organism, which these are terms from biology, and distill them into computer programs where you have the genes of this program and you have its traits that it has. And in an environment over many cycles of evolution, when it interacts with this environment, can you produce new changes to the organism's structure that helps it survive better in that environment through time. There were inventions of DNA languages that are in use in the time that try to mimic what human DNA is doing as a computer program. And many of these systems are multi-agent systems. Things like you can simulate traffic, for example, or look at ant colonies, looking at how out of these many different interacting agents, you have unique and interesting properties that emerge out of them. And von Neumann's lecture in the 1950s on the theory of automata is really, I think, the origin of this idea, the modern version of it. And it would be combined with a lot of work in evolutionary programming. Conway's Game of Life is another well-known example that was covered a lot in popular media, where a system made up of 4 very simple rules could produce really complex patterns and was also very sensitive to initial conditions. And you also have many different approaches to looking at programming from the evolutionary perspective. And this would lead to the 1980s with genetic programming, and eventually A-life was coined by Langton in 1986. There's another concept in here which I'm disappointed we don't really talk about too much anymore, which are evolutionary artificial neural networks. You can use evolutionary algorithms as a learning rule in neural networks, and I really don't see any papers too often doing this. But there are many approaches that you can use that help you avoid getting stuck at local minima in a way that some of the ways that we do today could still have problems. They can be more convenient sometimes when working with recurrent neural networks. And you don't necessarily have to specify your inputs and targets as often in advance like you do in supervised learning. There are other ways around this. The 1990s, we actually had combinations of neural networks with reinforcement learning. And there were improvements in computer graphics in the 90s that made it possible to run simulations of different morphology changes of organisms interacting in an environment. One of the more famous papers in 1994 by a guy ironically named Sims would study evolutionary morphology in these graphic systems. And this also has a heavy overlap with robotics. This is something we're not going to really go into today, but some of these areas were frequently part of the same academic literature, and many people were in both of these fields at the same time. So this brings up something which we haven't really talked about yet, which is this idea of non-representational learning. Rodney Brooks, the well-known roboticist, suggested that it's interaction, not instruction, that gives intelligence. It's exploiting the environment in a particular way, reasoning without representation. You don't need computation for intelligence, he argued. Intelligence is an emergent property. It's something that comes about from random search in particular environments. This was really emphasized by James Gibson in the 1970s. He's an ecological psychologist who claimed the visual system works this way. He said, you don't need to actually compute anything, or don't need to compute very much. You compute some things, but you can do a lot of it without representation. You just exploit the natural physical properties of the world. So when you look in a room and you see different objects around you that reflect light, there's some that he called are going to be invariants in the environment, where no matter where you are in the room, along a certain number of angles, the light appears pretty much the same on those objects. You can use those as an anchor, and as you navigate across the room following those, you don't need to compute where all the objects are in the room, you just need to follow those anchors. And those types of properties and the way that the physical world changes as we move through it can be used and leveraged in order to navigate, for example. And while some of these ideas have been useful in robotics, trying to do reasoning with it, like we do with classic symbolic systems, is not really possible. So it has some advantages for things in the area of robotics in similar fields, navigation and environments and so on. But these emergent approaches, Keith Downing's 2016 book, Intelligence Emerging, he gives this idea of thinking about how emergence happens in the animal kingdom, looking at different social systems, for example, birds that fly in a V pattern. We might think that's an intelligent behavior of some kind, that the birds have figured out and they're doing all this calculation to stay in that V shape. But you can actually show that if you have one bird who's just flying in the air and you have two others that are following and are just maintaining the height of the bird in front of them, and two more are following them and just simply maintaining height with the one in front of them, a V pattern will form out of that. And so something that appears to be intelligent behavior to us in some way, if you consider that intelligent behavior, might not actually be intelligence at all, but just a way of properties that arise out of systems like this. So this has led to a lot of different debates. This is still very controversial. There's arguments on both sides about this, and literature going back for 30 years talking about this. But in general, this is just one last point, that there's some people arguing that dynamical systems need to be used because they are continuous systems, and so discrete variables can't actually capture environmental dynamics. This was a very popular point of view in the 90s. It's sort of not as popular anymore. So this has led to a number of different approaches to thinking about cognition. I'm not going to really go into any detail on them here because they're each their own field, basically, but I've cited some papers that summarize the arguments pretty well. There's some books in here, too. So the Embodied Embedded approach is just emphasizing the idea that cognition and intelligence requires being embedded in an environment and using the body. This is a robotics type of approach that's very commonly employed. There's also the extended approach that was pioneered by Clark and Chalmers. The idea that we use instruments when we to compute things in the world, like a pencil. We use things to help us think that are not directly part of our brains themselves. So where should the boundary actually lie? And they argue about this quite convincingly in one of their papers. The embodied, embedded, and enacted approaches were combined together in a 1991 book by Varela and his coworkers, where enaction has to do with taking actions in the world. And the situated approach, which is also associated with robotics, is another way of thinking about this topic as well, about the environmental contexts in which you are embedded highly influences the way that you learn about your environment. So all of these approaches emphasize emergence in some way, and they emphasize agent-environment dynamics in a way that we don't really see too much with a lot of modern AI. And I think we can learn a lot from this. And that brings us to kind of the verdict here. It's clear that grounded representations might already be possible here, that these types of approaches might be using them. But we also looked at alternative representations that don't rely on representation, and it suggests that intelligence itself is an emergent phenomena. But one thing that we really have a problem with here is it's still not very good at doing the kind of classic reasoning that symbolic systems can do, and some of the types of learning that we can see in connectionist networks. So it's almost like a separate type of topic that's really used for a specific purpose and doesn't give us a general sense of what AI is. So the question now is, where do we go next? I'm a pretty big believer of not limiting yourself to just one way of looking at a topic. And we've covered a lot of different topics here on some level today. And the question is there an approach that exists out there that unifies all these topics together in one way? Is there a way to think about all of these things together that might help us answer these questions about intelligence and representation? Well, I'm going to controversially say that I think there's an approach to do this, and it comes from asking a more broader question about what is life in the first place. What is life is the name of Schrödinger's 1944 book, where he asks, how can the events in space and time, which take place within the spatial boundaries of a living organism, be accounted for by physics and chemistry? So in my opinion, the answer to this question comes from the work of the physicist and neurologist Carl Friston, who's created a unified model of the brain in neuroscience called the free energy principle, also now called active inference, which is a machine learning theory that unifies almost all of these ideas together and also extends it out to other living systems, to other kinds of groups that exist in stable ways over time, like societies and ecosystems, and other kinds of physical structures. It holds the key, in my opinion, to understanding both intelligence and representation. This is, of course, very controversial, and it's covered over hundreds and hundreds of papers, but I want to give a brief overview here today because I think more people exploring this idea in detail is kind of where I think the future of AI is headed. So I'm going to give a very general overview. We'll get you a starting point to looking into this in more detail. So as a motivating example, let's consider self-organization from the perspective of Terence Deacon's autogen, which is an example of a self-organized system. We imagine some chemicals in an autocatalytic loop that's shown here. They can transfer between these molecules. This kind of loop would form naturally through positive feedback, given a membrane which encloses it and brings them in close proximity with one another. So that barrier prevents diffusion, so we can guarantee that that loop will remain stable through time. And let's also say that we have some raw components that are needed here to both maintain the loop and also maintain that membrane. Well, we can also we have the raw components are actually outside of the membrane as well. Well, we can have negative feedback also stabilize this loop. So over time, the levels of X and Y inside the membrane would diminish. And if they get too low, the membrane would eventually collapse and gaps would appear. And then at this point, while the structure might be starting to collapse now because it's going to start diffusing and spreading apart, X and Y from the outside are now able to go in, and this replenishes the supply of X and Y, and the membrane is now able to heal up again. So what you're seeing here is a system which is self-sustaining. It's a very simple system that is able to revisit the same set of states over and over and over through time. It's homeostatic, it's a control system. Despite changes that are happening outside of it in the external environment, it can still maintain itself as some sort of thing that exists over a measurable period of time. So what we've done here is we've created a separation between inside and outside. There is something that is there, and there's something that's not there. What is there is the system that exists, and what's outside of it is the external environment. And this is important because from Friston's perspective, and from the perspective of physics, if something exists long enough that it's measurable, it's ergodic. It's something that exists long enough to be measured, and it revisits the same same states time and time again. So thinking about organisms now, in order for an organism to exist, by the same logic, a much more complex system than this, it would need to minimize the dispersion of its internal states. It would need to avoid thermodynamic decay and just spread apart how all its molecules spread out. And to do this, it would have to predict the future states of the external environment that it's embedded in. So how could an organism continue to revisit the same set of states over time to guarantee that it's going to survive? Well, statistically, the environment can be modeled as a generative process. It has structure, and it emits signals that can be observed. So from this perspective, thinking in terms of signals and receivers is very much in line with the control theory, information theory, and cybernetics perspective that we talked about earlier. In perception, taken from Helmholtz from the 1890s, the idea is to guess what in the environment could have caused the signals that the organism is perceiving. What is the cause of my sensory signals? In other words, organisms need to create a probabilistic model of their environment to determine what caused the signals they're observing. This is highly related to the Bayesian brain hypothesis and predictive coding. And these are models that are used in neuroscience. And under the Bayesian brain hypothesis, representation is no longer symbols. Representation are probability distributions representing the likely causes of observed environmental variables. Of course, observation of the environment is not directly possible. We are blanketed from actually seeing what those variables are, and instead have to interpret our sense organs themselves. And so in the literature, we often say that the environmental states are the hidden causes, and the sensory organs are the observed effects. They're the things that we actually can observe about the environment, is the actual sensations that we perceive. So the organism has to then use that sensory data and figure out what caused it. But there's a problem here in that the mapping between causes to effects and effects back to causes is many to one or one to many. Things are related to one another by context. Things are part of hierarchies. Things are changing through time. You can't really solve this problem very easily. It's ill-posed. Inverting effects back to causes is not a task which is easy to do. So the brain, according to Carl Friston and his colleagues, and which is now supported by a lot of work in neuroscience and psychology, suggests that the way to do this is something very clever that the brain is able to do, which is a machine learning technique. The idea here is that going from causes to effects can occur through a generative model. So there is evidence now to suggest that what's happening is the brain will predict from the causes, from the environment, it will predict what the effects would be from causes. They would generate this mapping here. So the idea is that you don't actually experience the world directly. You don't experience the actual sensory signals that you receive to your body. You experience a kind of hallucination, your brain's generation of the best estimate of what signals it expects to receive. And that's what perception actually is, not the real sensations in the world that's out there. And this idea is really powerful because it explains so much in neuroscience and psychology about how we look and we seek out evidence for our own models to confirm what we believe, because that's what helps us, it helps us survive and stay alive, is by confirming our models. And using a recognition model, you can then invert this and go backward to your predicted causes. So your brain first makes a best guess about what it thinks is going on. It's making a hypothesis. And then it inverts that hypothesis by testing it against reality with the attempt of bringing the approximate model of the world in line with the real model of reality such that you survive. So this idea has been highly influential, but there's still one part of it that's missing, and that's that we can bring in that embedded approach, the emergent approaches, by considering motor actions as well. that the organism can also take actions on its environment to sculpt it and make the signals that it receives the least surprising as possible. You go to work every single day. You follow the same sorts of routines every single day. Throughout the world, we have, throughout our cities, we have crosswalks and traffic lights. We have things that make our environments more and more predictable so we can continue to revisit the same set of states time and time again, just like that very simple example of an autogen, which continues to maintain itself by revisiting states that are the most predictable states they can possibly be in. So the idea here is that's what life is doing. It is actually predicting what the next state's going to be, and the best way to do this is to guarantee that you revisit the same states that are familiar to you. Carl Friston's actual papers mathematically describe the time evolution of these variables as nonlinear differential equations, so and how all these variables relate to one another between internal and external systems. And what you end up seeing here is that internal and external states, the internal states of your brain, your generative model, and the external states of the environment are conditionally independent from one another, separated in this causal graph by something called a Markov blanket. And as soon as the Markov blanket disappears, that is essentially what death is, according to this theory. It's the point where the internal system no longer represents the external system because it's not different from it anymore. There's no separation between inside and outside. And as Friston says, biological self-organization is not as remarkable as one might think and is almost inevitable given local interactions between the states of coupled dynamical systems. So Friston shows in his amazing paper, Life as We Know It, that if internal states encode parameters about external states, they become models of them. They must take actions optimally to maintain this separation between inside and outside, to maintain yourself as a living entity in the first place. What this means is you become a model of your environment simply by inhabiting it and predicting what the future states are going to be. You represent your environment. You become isomorphic to it. This is even seen physically in the brain where the separation of variables in space and time can be seen in the cortex, where things that are further apart in time outside in the world are in further layers in the cortex away from each other, as well as things that are further away in space in the world are in higher layers in the cortex compared to lower layers. And this is related to a central tenet in cybernetics called the good regulator theorem, that every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. And that's exactly what this theory predicts. From the perspective of machine learning, a probabilistic system that becomes a model of its environment and begins to predict what signals it expects to receive and revisits the same set of states time and time again is going to survive. So why is this so important? Well, the free energy principle tells us what life does. It doesn't tell us exactly what intelligence and representation is, but it's a very rich and deep mathematical theory that essentially governs, essentially grandfathers in every known statistical estimation scheme that exists. They all become special cases of the free energy principle. And in this way, we can simulate these types of systems and see what happens. And that's exactly what the neuroscience field is moving toward as a unified way to look at all types of living systems and social systems that exist ergodically. They exist for a long period of time. So maybe this is not the most satisfying answer, but it gives us a clue to think about where these questions come from. So I'm going to end this section, which is the last section, with a quote from Friston. It's a rather long quote, and since these topics are all very controversial, and I hope this encourages discussion to think about these in more detail, I think reading a quote in his own words will give us a perspective of the way that he thinks about these problems from the perspective of physics and machine learning. So this is what he says in one of his papers. Any system that revisits a particular set of states will necessarily be engaged in the process of minimizing surprise or maximizing evidence for its own existence. Systems that do not possess an attracting set of states dissipate, disperse, decay, or die. You are you because you revisit the neighborhood of these attracting states time after time. Your life traces out a path on this delicately structured attracting set or manifold. Technically speaking, you are a random dynamical attractor with an attracting set of states that fills a part of state space, yet has an intrinsically small volume, i.e. measure. In other words, of all possible states you could occupy, there are only a small number that you would characteristically be found in. Questions about the nature of life resolve into questions about the dynamics such systems must possess if they exist. In short, life is its own existence proof. So on that very controversial note now, given the optimism that I've given here about where AI is headed, I also want this lecture to be about the hype that's going on right now in deep learning and all of this push that we're putting in technology moving forward as we think about AI in this way. So this is the Gartner hype cycle, and you guys may have seen this before, but it talks about how technology often follows this sort of path. And the question for us is, where are we on this path? I've given the free energy principle as a way to consider that we might be going in a direction that's never been seen before for AI, but it's unclear where we are. So the two paths that I see, one I like to call the Ray Kurzweil Path. Ray Kurzweil is the director of engineering at Google, and he's a well-known futurist who's written many books about the future of AI and humanity. He says that by 2029, computers will have human-level intelligence. That's only 9 years away, and that the Turing test will be passed. And that by 2045, the singularity will occur, which is when humans will multiply our effective intelligence a billion-fold by merging with the intelligence we have created. So according to the Ray Kurzweil path, deep learning might be here, and today we're in 2020, and 2045 is Skynet. So the other path, which it's unclear, where are we now looking at the 1960s and the parallels between the first AI winter? Are we at the brink of a third AI winter, in which I'll be back in 15 years for the History of AI Part 3? It's unclear where we are on this timeline, and my hope is that by integrating all these different types of fields together, thinking about the different ways to look at AI, thinking about philosophy, thinking about neuroscience, and not restricting yourself to just one technology is the best way moving forward so we can learn from history. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure, yeah. So recommendations about how to get started back up on this area again, or? Yeah. So, I mean, my perspective really comes from neuroscience. That's because that's my background. And there is so much work going on in this area of looking at bringing together the ideas you're talking about with all these other ideas that are circulating now in neuroscience. And there are hundreds and hundreds of papers published every day that are related or similar to the kinds of things you're talking about. And they're really surrounding quite a group of maybe 100 or 200 different researchers that are largely in Europe, in London. But they are all interested in those ideas, and that's where I have the most knowledge and experience. So that's what I'm giving you from that perspective. But they would definitely be interested in that kind of work. There are even people who collaborate on these papers that are not directly affiliated with the university, for example, that still are contributing important simulations and data, and I think they would be very well received. Yeah. Yeah. This is actually a group at UCL, University College London, yeah, that does this. The Gatsby Computational Unit and a few others that are related across Europe as well. We can connect afterwards, and I can give you some more information on that if you're. No, not really in Austin. No, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah. Just go ahead. Sure. Yeah, so the question is just thinking about how, in contrast to kind of the pop culture fear about AI, thinking about how projects, which often take long-term planning and things like that, if there are ways to use AI for kind of the public good and making it, intergenerationally think about how we can plan ahead for different types of usages for AI. This is something which I think is really the kind of where I would hope to go in the future. I think that we spend a lot of money doing things that are very damaging to society, to the environment, and having ways to predict what those things are and incentivizing companies to invest in things and having a better perception in the public about what AI is and not the Skynet version of AI, which is what a lot of people think about, I think is highly important for humanity. And I think that's kind of, not seeing it as like a threat to us, which is often like, I did, one of my postdocs was in a hospital looking at brain tumors with deep learning, and I got a lot of pushback from radiologists who felt like I was encroaching in their space and going to take their jobs away from them or something like that. And I think looking at AI in the way that you're talking about as something that's can be part of us, more of a symbiotic relationship, is really important in the future, I think, rather than always portraying it as this threat to humanity, right? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, totally agree. It's great. Thank you for the question. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to quote a couple of sentences from the deep learning book. I mean, your presentation is much richer, deep, and vast. So I guess, well, the sentences from the book: artificial intelligence, the machine learning, the data-driven approach is the only viable approach to artificial intelligence. It can be contended that it is the only viable approach. And modern deep learning is not about imitating the brain or emulating the brain. It's about solving practical engineering problems. And then there is a different branch of science called computational neuroscience, which is about understanding the brain at a more fundamental level. So if we look at if the y-axis is the engineering miracles, then probably we might as well follow the top graph. Should we be looking at the AI? Should we be looking at AI and computational neuroscience differently? That's my question, if it makes sense.
Can you repeat one part of it? You said looking at them differently.
Should we be looking at deep learning, machine learning, and AI differently from computational neuroscience, which is more about emulating human intelligence?
So yeah, I think that they're definitely separate fields, and they have separate motivations for what they're trying to do. Computational neuroscience has always been more biologically focused, not necessarily as a practical engineering problem. But it's more, not that I don't think that those should remain as separate fields, but I think there should be much more of a space or intersection between the two. I think the founder of DeepMind published a paper 2 years ago called Neuroscience-Inspired AI. And that's the kind of thing I think I see as more of the future. There are algorithms and things that have been solved by the brain that can be ported over into a practical engineering context. One example is there's a fly, the ability of the fly to detect different compounds simplifies a common algorithm called locality-sensitive hashing. And it makes it much faster and much simpler in a single-layer neural network, essentially. And it's such a simple algorithm that just by studying the fly olfactory system, you get a new algorithm out of that right away that helps you do things faster and better. So I think just more intersection between the fields and more communication is really important. From my perspective, I'm interested in the more theoretical side of things, but I don't think it's the way to replace deep learning or anything like that. It's just to inspire you to think about problems in different ways and borrow from other fields. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was about cognitive bias when we think about perception and how whenever you misperceive something and you have some kind of an error signal here, can you read the last part of your question? Just to make sure I understand. Yeah. So it's more of an error signal, so it's something wrong with your model. That's kind of like you have these, it's a Bayesian approach, so you have some prior assumptions about the world, and they are used to help you to make a prediction with your model, and you're suddenly wrong about something. And that's kind of like, I mean, there are moments where this happens all the time, like, you know, you're gonna go and go to work or whatever, and you start your car and suddenly it just doesn't start. And you have this moment of like, it was not predicted at all. Every single signal you're getting is surprising. And that doesn't mean the world is wrong. It means you need to quickly update your model about what's going to happen next. What is my planning going to be? How do I perceive the next signals that I expect to see? What am I going to do in the next scenario? How am I going to deal with this problem? So you look at it more as an update signal, and the actual mathematics of it, it really is a form of prediction error. And that error is used as a way to create better models of the world, if that answers your question. So, okay. So another question over here somewhere. Good. Okay.
Sanjeev, thank you so much. Wonderful talk. Wonderful talks, plural. Let's continue this conversation across the street at CU29. I forgot to announce it at the beginning. It's a cocktail bar just across here. We usually have 15, 20 people come out. If you don't drink, I'll buy you water. Okay? See you over there. If you have any questions for Sanjeev, let's have them over there. Okay? Thanks. Goodbye.